Following the clerk's pronouncement on marriage, the merchant claims he knows all about weeping and wailing from his own marriage, a sentiment he believes many married people share. He asserts that even if his wife married the devil, she would overmatch him, having been married for only 2 months, and loathing every minute. The merchant sees a vast difference between Grisel's patience and his wife's cruelty. The host asks the merchant to tell a tale about his horrid wife, but the merchant, too sorrowful to share his own woes, offers another story instead. Once, in Lombardy, there lived a worthy knight, named January, who had spent 60 years nobly, but without a wife. Upon turning 60, whether out of devotion or senility, he decided to marry. Convinced that married life was paradise on earth, he sought a young beautiful wife. The narrator defies Theophrastus, who wrote against marriage, arguing that a wife is God's gift, more enduring than any gift of fortune. A lengthy passage follows, extolling the virtues of a wife and the sanctity of marriage, with many biblical examples. One day, January summoned his friends to announce his intent to marry, explaining that he was old and ill, and wanted a young wife he could mold like wax. His friends gave varying advice, some praising marriage, others warning against it. The core argument was between Placebo and Justinus. Placebo, citing Solomon, advised January to marry a young wife and do as he pleased. Justinus, citing Seneca, cautioned January to be careful and thoughtful, warning that a young wife might cuckold an old husband. January dismissed Justinus' caution, agreeing with Placebo that only a cursed man would argue against marriage. With that, they all rose, and January began preparing for his wedding. After considering many women, January selected one. January called his friends again, asking them not to argue against his decision. He voiced one concern: a man who finds perfect happiness on earth might not find it in heaven, as one must choose between perfect earthly happiness and heavenly bliss. Justinus, frustrated with January's foolishness, suggested that marriage might be January's purgatory, making him more likely to reach heaven. The narrator skips the wedding ceremony, but tells us January married May in a lavish and joyous celebration. Venus, the goddess of love, laughed at the guests, for January had become one of her knights. The merriment was so great it could not be written down. At the end of the feast, men cast spices around the wedding house, and everyone was joyful, except for Damon, January's squire, who was madly in love with May. The guests left, and January, fortified with spiced wines, took his young wife to bed. Despite his bristly beard scratching her tender skin, and his apology for what he was about to do, May found his sexual exploits useless. Damon, meanwhile, wrote a love letter to May, and pinned it in a silk purse next to his heart. When Damon was absent, the other squires told January he was sick. January sent May to visit Damon with a message that he would visit soon. May, receiving Damon's letter, hid it in her bosom, later reading it and deciding to reciprocate his advances. She replied, placing her letter under Damon's pillow and giving him a secret handshake. Damon's sickness vanished, and he resumed serving January humbly. January's house had a magnificent garden, described as unparalleled in beauty. January loved it so much that only he had the key. In summer, he would go there with May. By this time, January had become blind and increasingly possessive of May, causing grief for Damien and sorrow for May, who kept in touch with Damien through letters and secret signs. May imprinted January's key in wax, and Damien made a secret copy. On June 8, incited by May, January decided to go to the garden with her. He sought to wake her and tempt her to the garden. Blind January and May unlocked the gate and entered the garden. Damien, having been signaled by May, climbed a tree in the garden. At this point, the narrative shifts to the descent of Pluto and Proserpina, who argue about marriage. Pluto wants to restore January's sight to reveal the infidelity, while Proserpina argues that men's evil deeds are often overlooked. She supports May's actions, ending the argument forcibly. May told January she longed to pick a pear from the tree. January bent over for May to climb on his back. She climbed up, and Damien began to have sex with her. Seeing this, Pluto restored January's sight. January, witnessing his cuckoldry, roared in anger. May, without missing a beat, claimed she had been told that struggling with a man in a tree would restore January's sight. January protested, saying she was having sex, not struggling. May argued that if he saw them having sex, his vision was still impaired. Persuaded, January rejoiced that his sight was restored, kissed May, and led her home, delighted. Top of form, bottom of form.